Hi, everyone. You should be able to see us. So we're just going to try and turn on our videos, but otherwise we'll kick off in a second. Excellent. So I'll get us started, and hopefully in a few minutes you'll be able to see us. My name is Emily Hickson, and I am Climate Catalyst Director of Private Sector Engagement. And I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you today to our Green Steel 60 session of the India Green Steel Network. And this session is titled Scaling Transition Finance for Green Industrial Transition of the Indian Iron and Steel Sector. So today we are launching a set of recommendations developed by the IGSN Sustainable Finance and Green Industrial Policy Working Group. We like long titles at the IGSN. But this is a working group led by Climate Policy Initiative. I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of their fantastic work. And that working group is also supported by us, Climate Catalyst, and brings together financial experts, policymakers, industry leaders, all focused on accelerating decarbonisation of the India steel sector by scaling sustainable finance. So we have a really exciting panel of experts today who will discuss how we can scale transition finance to support decarbonisation of this sector. So I'm just going to try and get back up the slides. Excellent, here we go. And while we do that, we always like to, on IGSN webinars, ask people to introduce themselves. So I'd request if you could just use the chat, you should be able to use the chat, to please type your name, organization, and your location in the chat. And that's just so that we can all know who's on this webinar. So please just go into the chat and tell us your name, your organization, and where you're joining from. So we can see who's on this call. Great. On to today's agenda. On to the next slide, please. So, as mentioned, this session serves as an official launch of the working group's recommendations paper. And this paper has been a labour of love ever since June last year. So it's really exciting for us to be launching it today. So our session will start with a presentation from Satak Bruna, Senior Manager of Climate Policy Initiative, on the paper's key findings and recommendations. And then following the presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with, now you can see me. Excellent. I think our panel will also be able to turn on their videos now by the power of permission on Zoom. Excellent. There we go. We're not just AI bots. So following the presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with Neha Kumar, who's the head of the South Asia program at Climate Bonds Initiative, with Saurabh Trivedi, Sustainable Finance Specialist at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, another long acronym, IEFA, I think most of us refer that to. And last but not least, Hemant Malaya, Fellow at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, CEW. So thank you, everyone, for all of your inputs into the chat. I can see those coming through. That's really excellent for us to know who everyone is. Keep them coming if you haven't yet. So the panel will provide expert insights on implementing the proposed solutions and scaling transition finance to enable a low carbon future for India's steel industry. We'll then open the floor as the last piece of the agenda for a 15-minute Q&A session. So please, as the questions come to you, do use the Q&A function or put them in the chat as the presentations unfold, and we will have ample time at the end for the speakers to answer those questions. So next slide, please. Excellent. So just for you to know where you all are. So if you're not familiar with the Green Steel 60-minute series, so these are our series of 60-minute knowledge sharing sessions that are held once a quarter. And the sessions are designed to help us get to know each other and each of our work better in this community. So it also allows members to know what others are working on and explore possible areas of collaboration. So moving on to our first piece of the agenda. So as I've mentioned, our presenter today is Satak from the CPI India, where he leads on the low carbon transition part of CPI's work. So this work includes just transition, investment strategies for green hydrogen and battery storage, amongst other solutions, as well as industrial decarbonisation, and many other things. I know, Sadak, you work on. You're a busy man. So we're really honoured to have you with us today, Sadak, and I'd love to hand it over to you to start your presentation. I think we're switching slides. There you are. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll actually ask Zia to please bring up my slides. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So as Emily mentioned, that we have been working on this for more than 6 months now, and it's a product of a lot of hard work, discussions, deliberations, iterations, and we would like to walk everybody through what we have done and seek your comments on it. Also, I would like to thank the panelists because they have been instrumental in actually giving the inputs for developing this. So before we take this on, thank you all so much. Zia, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'll try to keep it brief and have as much time as possible for discussions. So I'll just give a brief context, what is, and because transition finance is something which is often confused with a lot of other terms, I'll just give a brief introduction to that. I'll talk about the framework that we have developed as a part of this paper and some recommendations that we have in it. Next slide, please. Okay. So why are we even talking about doing anything in the industrial sector? It is because it is responsible for a third of GHG emissions globally and roughly the same in India as well. And out of this, the iron and steel sector is pretty much the largest one with 12% share in country's total GHG emissions. And this is especially important because unlike most other sectors such as energy, where fossil fuels provide the energy behind the process, in industrial decarbonization processes, especially in iron and steel sector, the fossil fuels also act as feedstock. So that is why it makes it hard to abate. One, these are carbon intensive processes, and it is very difficult to replace these from this process because they are not just an energy provider, they are also part of the feedstock itself. India has set itself a target to reach net zero by 2070, which means net zero across all sectors. And to do that, industries will have to align, even in the most carbon intensive industries will have to align and shift towards a carbon neutral net zero pathway in the future. Next slide, please. So why do we talk about transition finance for the iron and steel? So one of the biggest problems that we have noticed till now is that unlike renewable energy in the electricity generation space, which is available, cost competitive, commercially available at scale, we do not have such a solution available for iron and steel sector, which is, while technically viable, but also commercially competitive, is something where we are still facing a challenge. And transition finance actually looks at hard to abate sectors, technologies which do not have a clear-cut, commercially viable, cost competitive alternative, a green alternative to them, and tries to reduce emissions across those sectors. So what the idea behind this is that we make sure that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. So while we are focusing on pure green technologies and electricity generation, which is renewables, for iron and steel sector, for cement, shipping, heavy duty transport, these are sectors where we still do not have cost competitive options. So there we are looking at transition finance where we can reduce the emission intensity and move towards a low carbon future while we actually work and innovate towards an absolute net zero technology that is commercially competitive. So there are a couple of enablers that exist in terms of transition finance. One, it cannot be given for any and every solution. There have to be some checks and balances. One of them is it needs an organization-wide decarbonization plan. This is not money to produce more carbon. This is money to actually plan a trajectory to net zero. It has to be a material shift from the business as usual scenario. It cannot be a marginal improvement. There has to be a science-based decarbonization pathway in the long term with tangible targets in the short and medium term. So it has to be measurable. And finally, most importantly, it has to be completely transparent and the disclosures have to be very, very strong. That is what we are targeting in terms of transition finance, especially for the iron and steel sector. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, that why do we look at transition finance for the iron and steel sector? So we have a bunch of technologies that are available right now. They exist across various TRLs, but not all of them are net zero. For instance, we have materials, technologies such as scrap utilization with renewable energy, which is near net zero. Is readily available, is commercially competitive. But the problem for a country like India is the availability of scrap isn't that high. You need a lot of fresh iron and steel to be manufactured, and we do not have sufficient technologies. For example, direct electrification or ore electrolysis is a fantastic technology, but it is still in early TRL levels. It is not technologically completely mature and definitely not commercially viable. So while these mature and become commercially viable, we need to find ways to boost other parts, for example, energy efficiency and heat recovery, increasing scrap utilization as far as possible, using renewable energy and battery energy solutions to at least replace the energy part of the system. So using all the available options that are there, which may not be net zero right away, may not be green right away, but are on the road to net zero and green. So that is why we are talking about transition finance in the iron and steel sector. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is broadly what we wanted to do and what we started out to do. Let's just get the basics in place. The understanding of transition finance in terms of definition and scope varies quite significantly. So for the purposes of this paper, we differentiate between financing a transition and transition finance. So financing transition includes everything which is to do with financing of RE capacity, green production, all of that. Whereas transition finance is financing of transitional activities towards the net zero, which are not green, not net zero today, but are on the road to there. And for that, we set up a thesis, a hypothesis to go through this. First, what are we looking at? We are looking to accelerate hard to abate sectors, accelerate transition to transition away from emission intensive technologies to low emission technologies, and actually create access to other inputs and resources. What are the broad principles that we are looking at when we do this? One, it has to be aligned to Paris climate goals. It avoids carbon lock-ins for the future. There should not be any near-term green alternatives that are immediately available. We do not want to waste the capital over there. Wherever there is a near-term green alternative available, we should pick the green alternative, but this is for technologies where it doesn't exist right now. And it has to be transparently monitored, reported, and penalized when there is a deviation. How do we do this? This can be done through a couple of ways. These are financial structures. One, it can be a KPI linked approach where the company decides that it can take up a couple of KPIs, such as one is reducing emission intensity per unit of revenue of the company. That is something that can be utilized as a KPI. The other option is use of proceeds, where we link the use of proceeds from these instruments to only replacing of carbon intensive equipment. And the third is general purpose money, which is given to organizations which have clear, credible transition plans in place. So this is not directed to any particular activity within those organizations, but a broader shift that the organization is looking to take. And there are multiple instruments that can be used in this. There is equity, there's debt, which in the form of direct loans, bonds, project finance. Then there is blended finance, trade finance, a lot of other things that are there, which will be discussed more as we go forward. Yeah. Next slide, please. So when we look at this, when we looked at this framework, it was broadly two sectors, which is the real sector, which includes the corporates and the policymakers, and the financial sector. And at the center of this, there are different pillars. There are broadly three pillars, if we may say so, three segments, six pillars, however you want to design it, which actually form the linkages between the different parts of the system. And if we look at it closely, when you see the paper, these actually are like parts of a jigsaw puzzle which fit in together. So the picture is not complete even if any one piece is not there. For example, taxonomy part of it, what does it do? It defines what transition finance is, what is the scope, what are the activities, what are the instruments that come under transition finance. Then there are national and sectoral plans, roadmaps, which actually help set the trajectory for it. Then there are corporate level plans, clear transition plans for organizations, which can actually help them raise this capital. There is a lot of policy support and regulations that we have talked about in this paper. Then we come to the financial sector, where the flow of transition finance is defined in terms of transitional activities, used of various instruments and traditional assets. So broadly, the recommendations are linked to these three pillars. It looks at the actions stakeholders can take to strengthen each pillar. For instance, in policy and regulation, India has set out a policy in the steel sector which is focused on growth, competitiveness, energy security, and the recent report by Ministry of Steel has laid down the path for transition, which is a step in the right direction. What we have done in this paper is we have mapped out the policy instruments across the value chain on demand side, supply side, and all cross-cutting ones in between. On the taxonomy side, a green steel taxonomy has been released by Government of India, and there is a plan to revise it every 3 years to keep raising the ambitions to actually meet and actually set global benchmarks with that. Finally, in terms of transition plans, we have included 11 elements of transition plan assessment in the framework to assess the credibility of transition plans based on the guidance that has been issued by OECD, ASEAN, and Climate Bonds Initiative. Next slide, please. Okay, so just coming to the recommendations part of it, how are these structured? So what we have done is we have the pillars, there are recommendations, there are time frame and priority, and who are the relevant stakeholders involved in each of these. And the time frame and priority is across high, medium, and low, and from 1 year to 5 years. So that is the time frame that we're looking at. And so on the climate and finance taxonomy part, we looked at the need for a national sustainable finance taxonomy, and which defines the scope of green and transitional activities and harmonizing the national taxonomy with sectoral transition pathways and interoperability with taxonomies across the globe. And we're very happy to say that our paper actually looks at all of this, and we are aligned with the MOS Ministry of Steel roadmap on the recommending green public procurement as one of the key measures of a policy lever for decarbonizing the steel sector. And also interoperability of taxonomies is something that we have highlighted as a part of this paper. On the policy and regulation side, one more thing that is a little critical to actually do in the near term is design and implement a green industrial policy, which looks at this entire ecosystem as a whole, which looks at how the impact of iron and steel sector ripples across the industrial sector in the country and create demand for transition finance through this. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. On the second part of it, where we look at the sectoral pathway and the technology roadmaps, we have looked at development of iron and steel sector transition plan and emission technology pathways to net zero, and what are the long-term and interim targets, and how do we differentiate between trajectories for primary and the secondary steel sector. So this is one of the important recommendations that we have put in, that the pathways for the primary steel sector will not be the same as those for the secondary steel sector, and they need to be differentiated and delineated at the beginning itself. Also, we have asked for an integration of the pathway with the climate finance taxonomy and define screening criteria for transitional activities. We have proposed a quantitative threshold-based screening of activities rather than directly listing out the activities on what activities and technologies should be qualified. On the credible transition plan part, disclosures become a very important aspect. And the one thing that we have suggested is mandating disclosures of corporate transition plans, including the net zero target under BRSR. Also, Neha, who's here, actually made a very important suggestion in this, that we should actually suggest making compulsory disclosures for FIs to ensure the coverage of small FIs which are there in the ecosystem, because BRSR applies only to the 1,000 largest listed companies, and a lot of smaller FIs can actually fall through the cracks. So that is one thing that we have also added to this. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. I think this is the last slide that I have, and I'll be very happy to have more discussions on this. So the final pillars that we looked at were the financial instruments and the mechanisms. So our idea was that the financial instruments under this should not be limited just to sustainability linked bonds or sustainability linked loans. It needs to include all existing and new and innovative instruments for actually helping move the needle. It'll also have to be transition bond, transition loans, blended finance, equity instruments, anything and everything that we can think of which can actually help do this. Instruments conducting finance flows to enable an entity to transition to lower emission may not necessarily be limited to what is labeled as transition finance and or sustainability linked loans. So we have to broaden the horizon for all of these. And suggestions have been put forward proposing that any instrument may be categorized as providing transition finance if it incentivizes an entity-wide transition and enables them to move to a lower emissions and lower future risk perspective in the long term. Also, one thing that we have suggested through this is improving the awareness of organizations in the real sector and in the financial sector, and ensuring the availability of granular data for better decision making. So this has come from a deep understanding of how the sector operates, and we realize that especially in the secondary steel sectors, a lot of players have suffer from lack of adequate understanding of how the financial system moves, and often leading to bad financial practices also, and which hinders their access to international capital. So what we have proposed is a lot of capacity building for them to bridge this gap. That is all that I had. So next slide. Yeah, that is all that I had in terms of the presentation. I'm very happy to hand it back to Emily for more discussions.
Thank you very much, Sadak. And all of it was a lot. So thank you. Really, really valuable work. So now we're going to move into our panel, which is going to be really exciting. I'm going to ask them to react to this report. So we're going to actually start with Saurabh. So Saurabh, as I said before, is a sustainable finance specialist at IEFA and has done extensive research on financial risks and the opportunities of the energy transition. And I'm just going to start by asking you, Saurabh, what stood out to you about the recommendations paper?
Thanks, Emily, and hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate IGSN and Climate Policy Initiative to come out with this report. It's a great report, I think, and quite needed, especially after the taxonomy that has come out by the Ministry of Steel. And it further tries to clarify a lot of the things which are never clear about transition, I would say. So that would help a lot. And there's so many technologies which are involved, so many activities, especially in this sector, which needs a lot of clarification. And I think that is something which has been very clearly laid out in this report. So that was quite important as well. And one thing in terms of the recommendation, which are very clearly segregated, especially who is responsible for what kind of activities, like, and which ministry is going to take what kind of action, and all those sort of things which are clearly specified, of course, requires a lot more work now for each of these components. But if you have to go through what could be the transition finance space for Indian steel, Indian green steel. This is one report that one can start with.
Yeah.
Few things that I would say has to be clear, like in terms of the pure finance lens, whether all these things will actually entice the corporate issuers to start doing it. Whether this transition finance is going to reduce the cost of their financing, whether there's any kind of incentive for these even the large scale integrated steel producers, whether they are going to do it or not, especially from the Indian context. We know that there are few which are already trying to do in other geographies, although headquartered in India, but do they have enough incentive, and whether these instruments itself are going to mitigate some of these cost implications of these technologies through the transition finance instrument that we have, or the transition finance disclosures. Of course, they are quite critical to fit all the, like, if you look from the investor perspective, who are more interested to understand where they're investing, all these things are very important. But when you look from the corporate issuer perspective, it becomes quite challenging for the corporate unless it needs that special capital from that special investor. It does not solve that problem of cost of financing. So maybe that is one question I would like to discuss in detail when we move ahead with this discussion. But I will stop here.
Well, it's a central question, isn't it, Saurabh? How do we get this all lined up to provide the right incentive? I mean, I just wanted to just probe just one more point on you before we go to the rest of the panelists. I mean, how do you think investors should evaluate, start to evaluate corporate transition plans in the steel industry, and what do you think are the primary financial risks that they are looking at, on the pathway to trying to provide more of those incentives and make this look more attractive? What are the key kind of financial risks that they'll be considering that we really need to be unpicking?
The only is that a financial investor has to look, if they're very serious about the climate impact, is the cost of externality, whether that has been priced or not in any kind of these assets, the counter assets as well, especially, which is not the case actually, because we are not living in a ideal world where the markets are very efficient and then all these externalities are efficiently priced in the carbon intensive steel production. If that has been the case, then you would have seen that some of your green steel would have been already cost competitive at certain point, but that is not the case. So what they can look, of course, they have to look the seriousness of these investors, what Sarthak has already laid out, like whether they have a corporate-wide decarbonization plan or not, whether and how does that plan actually aligns with the geography where they are going to produce this steel, whether that is aligned or not. One important thing that sometimes, especially now, if you look in the Indian context, most of these assets are going to be financed by the banks, local banks, and they have burned their hand in the sector because of the cyclical nature of this sector. In the past, a lot of NPAs have been the case in the sector. Things that they should start comparing both the asset class and the absence of a clear carbon pricing. One thing that they can look. Now, if you look at the BF-BOF, you see that around 60 to 70% of the total cost of that particular project is hinged on the metallurgical coal, which is a huge import risk. And that comes primarily from Australia, like 70% is imported from Australia. And that creates a lot of cyclical risk, the commodity cycle risk that gets incorporated in when the banks do the credit evaluation of these projects. There can be a case for green steel technologies that, because you will not require met coal in most of the cases in green steel technologies, then are they ready to modify their credit risk evaluation models to say, okay, now as compared to BF, BOF, you're not using a very volatile uh, commodity that is met coal, whether that is going to reduce some of the credit risk or for the green steel, and then start um, providing at least the working capital at a much favorable terms.
Yeah.
So all
Yeah.
those things, it has to be a relative comparison in terms of risk and return evaluation by the investors.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sir Urban. Yeah, thank you, particularly for that overview of all of the different price risks. So next we'll go to Naya Kumar from the Climate Bonds Initiative. So Naya, it would be remiss of me not to really ask you, what role do you see green bonds and sustainability linked instruments playing in financing the India steel transition?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Sarthak, for this presentation. I know that all of us have, given inputs earlier, but it is always good to see the final product being presented to many more of us. Before I get into your specific question, I just wanted to take up a couple of points that were spoken just before me by Saurabh.
Yeah.
And also just step back a little bit in terms of what is I mean, the paper has a lot of good entry points, good kind of suggestions, both for policy as well as for market development. But how does this fit into the current, developments that are happening? I think that is something that we should be talking about. So, my big sort of remark is that transition has to be seen. Sarthak, you said transition planned at an entity level and not only an activity level, but you also talked about the ecosystem, right? So I think transition of real economy and financing that transition is a very, very interconnected challenge, right? So iron and steel won't be able to transition all by itself if there is no demand. And where is that demand coming from? This is as much as coming from buildings to, everything else that it is also inputting into. So this forward and backward linkage will be very important to consider. And perhaps, we should think of it more proactively in terms of setting also the ambition. So not only the sectoral transition pathway that we are all hoping that Niti Aayog and others, CEW, etc., who are here and others that they are looking at, but are we, according to the Ministry of Steel, which is a fantastic, a next step forward, but the threshold that they are looking at, that of course, where do we sit in relation to that threshold, domestically as well as in the interconnected international system, where if you look at some of the companies which have raised money from abroad, they raised money, for example, through a sustainability linked bond like a JSW, which is the first steel company ever to raise an SLB. A couple of years ago in 2021, the investors had asked JSW to look at meeting the threshold of 1.9 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel made. And that was much ahead of, 3 years ago. They went ahead with it. But now if they want to raise money from the international investors, it's going to be even tighter threshold. So we have to sort of look at that. How do our taxonomies, our policy measures are agile enough to take all of these developments into account? And so, yes, just now talking a little bit on the instrument side, but also to what Saurabh said, no, that, if you look at the present era, we used to think, oh, sustainable finance, it's a big opportunity, but now it's actually, we are getting very quickly into the era of competition. Countries, industries, they're trying to see how can they really have the competitive edge. So there may be certain things, like you said, Saurabh, that we are so coal dependent, our industry, our steel production is so coal dependent. Now, whether to shift quickly to something else would give them a short-term to a medium-term competitive advantage, almost always hangs heavy, right? So then how do the other levers in the ecosystem, whether they're policies or incentives, can push that idea a little bit forward, will be important. Now, quickly coming to three other things, in fact: taxonomy, transition planning, and instruments. So instruments, of course, like Saurabh, you said, we would need all kinds of monies to flow into the ecosystem. So hence, different instruments will be used. But these instruments will need some kind of a credibility system, an assurance system to ascertain that the targets set are credible, they are against the sector best average, they're not only decided by the company, etc., etc. So those things will be coming into play pretty quickly. What we have in the current regulatory system is sort of a nudge, but I think when we talk about these kind of loans or bonds which might be general purpose, you will need to get much more granular, because that's where you will need to track exactly the progress that you have said that you will make on transitioning. Within this whole thing, transition planning will become extremely crucial, very, very crucial. And that will also include, if banks are our, not if banks are our main source of financing, a very active, proactive dialogue between lenders and their borrowers, understanding their steel portfolio, how are the companies doing, and actually engaging in a very active way, and perhaps even ideas of syndicating loans, when more than one banks come to really support their borrowers in their transition journey, would be kind of things that we should be looking forward to, or we should be at least having conversations on when we're trying to support the real economy to also move forward. But banks can only do as much. We would need data from the real economy also, and hence go back to your point on disclosures. Quickly moving into the regulatory and policy initiative of taxonomy, Ministry of Finance is now set itself the technical committees looking into taxonomy, and of course that process will take its own discussion, so I cannot speak too much on its behalf, but I can just say what my personal views are. That one, that the transition lens is an embedded feature in our taxonomy. I think that's pretty much clear. And what does that even mean, right? So you said that it is not pure green, but then how do we translate transition into something which is easy to use by and easy to understand by investors and borrowers? So across the world, taxonomies have adopted a traffic light system. They do by green, amber, red. And I think that, combined with some of the suggestions that are contained in the paper, have a trajectory approach, have intermediary targets, so that companies can course correct, and you can also account for development of technology. Ideally, it should be technology agnostic, like you said, and set those tightening thresholds on the emissions intensity that need to be reduced over a period of time, given how the technologies are progressing. And of course, there would, taxonomy itself does not go into transition plans, etc. But taxonomy can help you set the targets and the trajectory, which are an integral part of transition plans. So those things will be very important. The balance will have to be perhaps maintained between the complexity, which is by very nature very inherent in this whole system, and the usability and implementability. So I'll pause right now over here, and then we can go into the details.
Thank you, Neha. Tour de force as usual. And thank you for reminding us to kind of zoom out and look at the whole value chain. from the demand all the way through, that kind of forward and backward look, as you said. And I think that point about the active dialogue we're going to need to expect, particularly between lenders and companies, is something that we in the kind of NGO civil society community can be supporting through, of course, the research that we're doing, focus on transition planning, because that's certainly going to be something that we need to encourage. So Hemant, going to come to you last, but certainly not least. So Hemant, I'm just going to ask you, if that's okay, to kick us off on kind of the more policy sides, and Neha was kind of leading us into it a little bit. But how do you think this report contributes to ongoing policy discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me on, and congratulations on the report, more so because you are able to cram in all kinds of stuff in 25 pages or less. I think that's a, that's a great thing, because then readers can peruse it fairly quickly. So getting into the policy bit, so I'm not a core finance person. So really my views are from a policy, person looking into finance. And what does it mean, right? From what does policymaker do for finance, to be enabled? And in that sense, I think the report is fairly prescriptive on what needs to happen. I think some of the, areas which are sort of not usually considered policy making, such as disclosure and taxonomy, are fairly important. But then from a policymaker's perspective, that does not kind of, come on the top of the list. Although from the financial institution perspective, that might be very important just to understand what the risks are, right? So I think in that sense, the finance sector view on what needs to happen was very important to come out. And I think that's where the paper is, very useful. Very quickly on how we look at it, I think the financial community looks at risks and, then kind of looks at, what is the cost of capital. I mean, really, it's not finance that is not available. It's really the lower cost of finance that is required to enable these decarbonization policy, projects, which is a problem. And the way we look at it is, how do you mitigate those risks to then enable finance to come in, right? And there are different kinds of risks. I don't think that's explicitly covered in your paper, but we are looking at, and I think Neha alluded to it, but it's infrastructure risk. Okay, you want to decarbonize, you need power. Do you have the grid to be, able to move that power? Do you have, enough land to deploy RE capacity, right? So then there are project risks. Do you have the off-taker? If you don't have an off-taker, very, few financial institutions will be able to lend unless it's a large conglomerate and, bringing in capital on their balance sheet. Then there is technology risk. It's very convenient to talk about transition, but the fact of the matter is, lot of the technologies required for transitioning are really in their, mid-level stage in terms of TRL, or there's a one-off case, someone has tried out something. And the green hydrogen-based steel making is one case in point. There's one single plant in the world, and that too is not a commercial scale plant. It's really a small, commercial scale pilot, I can call it. And therefore, that cannot be a, representation of, risk management from the financial community part, right? Then there is a trade risk, which again, CBAM is one of them, but there are other circularity and sustainability related measures that are going to be problematic for companies, especially in sectors that are, highly exposed to, trade. And then finally, political economy. Not so much maybe in the case of iron and steel, but in some sectors like fertilizer, where subsidy plays a major role. How are you going to overcome those legacy issues to then allow finance to come in? So unless we are able to solve for all of these risks, I think finance will always look at green projects as being riskier than conventional fossil-based projects, and therefore the cost of capital will always be higher. And I think that's something that we have seen historically, is what I'm told. So if we want to, get low cost of finance, then I think we have to address those risks from a policy perspective.
Excellent, Han. And I think maybe through the questions, we might come back a little bit more to examine some of those different green industrial policy instruments and how they, which ones we think are going to be most successful at overcoming some of those risks that you just outlined, everything from price risk, tech risk, op risk. Because yeah, there's a lot of risk, and we'll need to target our money effectively. So I'm going to open up to the Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes for this. And we've got a couple of questions coming in that I'm going to start with, but please do add yours into the Q&A part of the Zoom webinar. And if you can't figure that out, just drop them in the chat. So I'm going to start from this one from Jyoti. Apologies if I've said that wrong. Who's asking, so in addition to the disclosure of a transition plan, presumably for a steel player, how do you see verification and accreditation as one of the mechanisms to build credibility? And then additionally, how can carbon markets and carbon pricing support transition finance? But yeah, the first part of the question there, how can verification and accreditation of these transition plans kind of come into play?
Can I take a little bit on this?
Yes, lovely. Go for it.
I'll just start us off. Yeah. So it's a very, very good question. And just take a leaf out of how the green financing worked, right? So if you look globally, green finance, when done in a structured way, transparency is at the core of it. And you have people who are able to say, and it's not only that, okay, solar, it's also say transport. So what actually qualifies for green? So again, we go back to the need of certain standards, certain taxonomies. But usually there is an assurance system. And globally, because wherever this, the green bonds are being issued, at least internationally, that verification system is pretty solid. You have people who are trained on these standards. They will look at your documents. They will give you certain assurance based on that. And then the certification provider will also say, okay, tick, 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 and everything is good to go. Now, for all of that, what you needed was criteria. Now, for transition finance, this is where we are at. So globally, there are frameworks. They have developed sector level criteria. So there is steel level criteria. Now, if you talk about if the CCUS has to be used as one of those prospective, investments, then there is criteria on that also. So all of this verification requires very clear definitions and criteria for this to be in place, first of all. And then a body of people, really, a body of institutions or different institutions who get expertise and who will actually help you out to say that you are on track or not. And then it's a system. We are not going to be starting from scratch in India. I think there is, because of companies which have been raising money from abroad, they're very aware of these things. But definitely a lot needs to be done to build the assurance ecosystem as well. So on carbon credits, all I would need to just say was that it cannot be the first course or first recourse to, saying, so offsets is not what you're looking for, right? You're actually looking at emissions reduction. So it is only the residual emissions that you should be looking at in terms of offsetting through carbon credit trading, not the first level.
Thank you, Neha. And I was wondering if anybody else wants to build on that, particularly, how can carbon markets and carbon prices support transition finance?
Yeah, I guess I can very quickly come in both on the disclosure bit. I think one of the challenges, so again, I'm looking at it from the business end and policy end. One thing we are seeing is that there are a whole bunch of different protocols, frameworks, accreditation agencies, verification bodies, and it's a circus out there, right? So I think to a certain extent, we need to rationalize and standardize all of those. Without which I think it's going to be very difficult moving forward for businesses as well as for the financial community. On the carbon market, I think it's too early in India for carbon market to make any substantial difference as far as bridging the premium on anything green. For two reasons. One is it takes a long time for carbon markets to settle down. EU ETS, which is kind of the emblem of, the biggest and the baddest ETS system. I don't think it has fully stabilized yet after two decades of operation. So it'll take a long time before we are successful. Secondly, in a market, you're only trading the marginal units. You're not paying a tax on the entire emissions footprint, and therefore, if you look at the total volume that gets traded, it's a small fraction of the total emissions. So then, if you dilute the price of carbon, even if it, let's say, is 100 euros a ton, it's not going to make a substantial difference when it comes to the pricing of the product, right? So that's what matters the most. The market is looking at bridging the premium. It's not looking at merely the signal of having a carbon market, which may not be the same as for the financial institutions. So those are two slightly different things. So financial institutions may kind of like it that, hey, you're participating, and as a consequence you're being judicious about it. But as far as product pricing goes, it's not going to make any significant dent.
As far as bridging that premium goes, wouldn't go all the way. Okay, going to another question, keeping our panel hot on their toes. Got quite a simple question here, or is it? Where is the finance expected to come from? And what are we doing to generate awareness for those financiers? So we've talked here on this webinar today about lenders, banks being a big part of providing this finance. Do any of you have any comments on where you would expect the financing to come from? Maybe Siddharth, because you've showed that map of the kind of capital stack that we would expect moving through time with different risk levels and different PRL levels.
See, we do not expect new financial pools to get created just to cater to this, being very honest. So a lot of this will be redirected capital, and Neha can correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as the capacity building of the financial sector is concerned, that is of critical importance. That is something that we've also mentioned in the paper. That is something that we are doing. Neha and her team is doing. CWIF, I'm sure they're also working in that sector as well. So developing that understanding in the financial ecosystem is of critical importance. Also, just touching upon something that has already been discussed, that yes, it needs to lower the cost of capital. That is of critical importance, of course. But also what it needs to do is actually make capital available for these activities. Because what we have done is we have right now defined a green finance, which is preliminary for green activities, and everything else is considered as damaging to the ecosystem, environment, ecosystem, climate change, and either it's green or that. But what we are looking at is that there are technologies which may not be completely green, but they're actually good. They are not ideal, but they are good. They are on the road to green. So they need to be financed as well. And the idea behind defining this, setting up taxonomy, setting up targets, ensuring that we don't create fresh lock-ins is actually part of that exercise, where you understand that capital may not be given for just the green part of it, but also for the transitional activities part of it. So that is where this comes from.
So I'll just add to what Sarthak has said. Look, I mean, if you're looking at the sources of domestic or international, I think it's good to sort of divide it. There is international capital looking at transition projects actively. So if you're able to convince your investor that you will be transitioning in a fairly robust, ambitious manner, it's backed by transition plan, etc., then we have had deals in India itself. We're looking outside of India and mobilizing capital. Deals are happening. These are usually called, sustainability linked bonds, etc. By the way, there is also a sustainability linked loan conversation, which is pretty active and vibrant. And, our own banks, which are housed in the Gift City, for example, they have mandates to go into this direction. So a mix of, natural investor demand, which is offshore, and some sort of creator demand, which will have to be put within the domestically. It'll be a mix of these two to create that investor interest, especially domestically. And I think without regulatory support or nudge or mandates, that may not come about so quickly. For example, I'll just give you one example. You would see pension funds, etc., disproportionately investing into these low risk, low carbon projects and pathways, plus green, okay, green activities. You don't have that kind of a thing in India, right? And we probably require a different lever than what happens and how things like this actually come about in the developed economies. So here there is, whether you say understand it in terms of PSL or quotas or mandates, something will have to be constructed
Yeah.
to be able to support the system to move forward.
Yeah.
Thank
Saurabh,
you for clarifying. Where the first point that I made, that we'll not create new sets of capital. It is more like going deeper into the ones that we have identified, creating the right incentives to actually broaden the buckets, which Neha clarified. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. And move it. Saurabh, after you.
Okay, so we should know like who are the biggest capital providers, who are the managers of that capital, right? These are the big three, which are not going to move and they are holding around $20 trillion of assets at this point, and they're not going to move the capital unless the risks are properly priced in the valuations of these assets. Now, so you lose a very big chunk, and the capital market movers, you leave away them because they are not going to invest in any asset which are not commensurate with their risk return profile, right? And unless they move, it's very difficult actually to move the overall market, and in fact to move the corporate behavior as well eventually. So now what has to be done till the time that those risks start getting priced, whatever I mentioned earlier, like different means of pricing those risks. As Hemant also said, right, there are no projects at this point across the globe which are commercially viable. Most of these projects are getting sustained only at the back of government capital, public finance, and that is still missing in India. And a major component of public finance is our international financial institutions, which currently do not have any kind of, most of them at least, do not have any kind of strategy to decarbonize the industrial decarbonization process. So that is a big missing piece that has to be solved. And they are the ones which are going to de-risk these assets till the time the risks are properly priced. So that so we cannot wait for 3, 4, 5 years that the risk start getting priced. So till that time, we need the institution to have a proper framework, have their industrial decarbonization strategy properly set up from the public finance institutions perspective. Capital markets will move later, banks will move later. They are not the first risk taker institutions. So we have to understand that.
I really encourage people to have a look at that diagram in the paper. But there we have it. So where's the money coming from? And we've had answers around, it exists, it needs to be shaped and attracted with those types of incentives that definitely Hemant spoke to earlier. But also there is a significant piece of public funding that has been essential to ensuring that that other projects have been able to attract this type of transition finance. So public funds play a role as well. So I'm going to wrap us up and just thank our panel because we dived quite deep into some of the biggest, most difficult pieces of this. So I really encourage everyone to download and share the paper. It's there in the chat and you can find it on the Climate Catalyst website. And we will, after this webinar, just be sending you a very quick survey of how you found it. So please take 30 seconds to fill that in. It's there on our screens right now. So you can just quickly vote. So I just want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our panel and wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where does one leave?
You can leave, yeah. Thanks, Neha. Speak soon.